2018 assassination of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul haunts everyone who cares about press freedom and human decency, as does the 2017 murder of Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, whose journalist son is on our panel today. You can see from the Freedom House graphics, which are in fact up behind the stage, how much press freedom has declined globally in recent years, with just an estimated 13% of the global population living in countries with a truly free press. Since 1992, 855 journalists have been murdered around the world, and no one has been held responsible, no one, in more than 85% of those cases. Today we have an expert panel to explore the significance of the current decline in press freedom and what can or should be done to reverse the trend. We'll consider to what extent a free press is a positive force in creating the transparency necessary to facilitate strong societies, innovation, robust trade, economic growth, the kinds of things people at Davos care very much about. Is sunlight, in fact, quote, the best of disinfectants, as US jurist Louis Brandeis has asserted? Or are there good reasons for some restrictions on speech, such as clamping down on disinformation and promoting security and stability? And of course, we'll need to ask what responsibility the media itself bears for its, we'll say, spotty reputation in providing accurate, responsible coverage, and what news organizations and social media platforms might be able to do about it. I'll introduce our terrific panelists. We really have an amazing panel. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Marty Baron, who's on the end here, is executive editor of the Washington Post and famously in the movies, former editor of the Boston Globe. Matthew Caruana Galizia, who was a data journalist and lead software engineer at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, but now he's focusing mostly on working to pursue justice for his murdered mother. Tina Kandelaki is general producer at Russia's Match TV, the national sports channel of the Russian Federation, and co-owner of Apostol Media Group, which produces programs for leading Russian TV channels, and a major player on social media, which we'll get to a little bit later. Kumi Naidu is Secretary General of Amnesty International and former Executive Director of Greenpeace International. And Alexandra Vucic is President of Serbia and formerly that nation's Prime Minister. So let's get started. And I do want to start with Marty and a question about Khashoggi. First of all, are you disappointed in the global reaction to the assassination of Khashoggi? And would it make a difference to press freedom generally if there was more kind of global public support for him and support for finding out what actually happened?
Well, we're disappointed all along the way. We're disappointed with what the Saudi government did, first of all. This was Jamal Khashoggi walked into a diplomatic mission to obtain documents for his imminent marriage, and he was brutally murdered. He was dismembered. His body still hasn't been found. The Saudi government said from the beginning that he walked out freely, that they did nothing, and we learned later that in fact he was murdered. And to date, we feel that there hasn't been full accountability for that murder. And we don't feel that the U.S. government has brought enough pressure on the Saudis. We don't feel that other governments have brought enough pressure on the Saudis because of this. And I think that, we have to take a look at, well, why was he murdered? He was murdered for expressing an opinion that at times was contrary to the official opinion of the Saudi government. And we also have to look at, well, how do we know what actually happened there? Because the Saudi government initially lied about what occurred there. And the reason that we know about that is because of a free press, a press that investigated this, which was persistent, that tried to unearth the facts and did unearth the facts. And then ultimately the Saudi government needed to acknowledge that in fact a team of individuals went from Saudi Arabia to Turkey, to Istanbul, with the express purpose of murdering him. And that's why we need a free press, is to dig deeply and to hold people accountable. And so we're dissatisfied all along the way, obviously dissatisfied with a brutal murder and horrified by a brutal murder of one of our colleagues, but dissatisfied that the world is not bringing enough pressure on a government that engages in those kinds of activities.
So just to begin to tee up a question I know we'll deal with more broadly, why should businesses care? I mean, so much of what journalists write are considered negative by businesses. Businesses hire whole PR staffs to try to deflect journalists from finding out what's going on. Why should businesses care about something like the Khashoggi murder or press freedom generally?
Sure. You know, I think back to when I was in college and I read Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom. He at the time was focused on how you need economic freedom in order to have political freedom. But I think the reverse is also true. In order to have economic freedom, you have to have political freedom. And what is at the base of political freedom? It is freedom of expression, and that's why it's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And there is no democracy in this world without a free and independent press. And why do you need it? Because otherwise it reverts to a government where things are decided not based on the competition of ideas, but based on corruption, based on cronyism, based on favoritism, and a role of an independent free press and a responsible press is that it holds government accountable when it engages in those kinds of activities.
Okay. Let me turn to Kumi Naidu. You've said, quote, the patterns of oppression that we're living through are interconnected. So I was wondering, in your work, what do you see as the interconnections between free press and human rights?
The connection between free press and human rights is fundamental. Firstly, for Amnesty, as well as other civil society organizations, whether they're NGOs, trade unions, faith organizations, and so on, we actually critically need a free press to tell the stories of the work that we are doing at the local level. And the truth be said, we in civil society have always had a problem of not being able to have access as much as the issues that we feel that we're handling. As climate change is showing, I mean, some of us have been banging on for decades on climate change. Most of the mainstream media ignored it because our governments and businesses were pushing back on it and so on. But the three freedoms that are most critical from Amnesty's perspective in terms of for making of a vibrant democracy, it's the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom of expression. And obviously, media freedoms is right there at the center. I would like to say, though, that it's important that we contextualize this conversation within a broader kind of analytical narrative, and would like to introduce a thinking from a French philosopher, Althusser, who said that most of us make the mistake of thinking that governments and businesses and people in power control the narratives by the deployment of what he called the repressive state apparatus, that is force, army, police, formal laws. But then he went on to say, but actually the bigger threat for us is the ideological state apparatus, which is the freedom, the media environment centrally. Today it includes social media, obviously, framework for religion, schooling, and so on. So let's be blunt about it. The conversation we're having here at Davos, if I can be quite brutal, is not the conversation we should be having right now. We are still having the conversation of how do we protect the system, how do we maintain the system, how do we recover the system from the financial crisis. If the 2008 financial crisis, as well as the 1997 Asian financial crisis, taught us anything, it should be that what Davos and this forum should be doing is looking at system redesign, system innovation, and system transformation. Because the current system, you can do whatever you like with it, it's not going to get us to addressing inequality, the fourth industrial revolution, and certainly it's not going to help save our children and their children's futures from climate change.
Okay. Thanks, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues. Let me turn to Matthew, and then I'll come back around to President Vucic and Tina. So you've noted that covering corruption can be as dangerous as covering conflict, and certainly, tragically, that's what your mother discovered. Speaking, again, largely to a business audience, what would you say is the good to society and the economy of actually covering corruption? What I'm trying to get at is, we in the press can be very sort of self-righteous about how it's wonderful to have free press. What are we doing for them?
I mean, we need to remember that journalists are not prosecutors. They're no kind of judicial authority. They have no executive power. They're the investigators of last resort. That's what my mother was. Journalists only have to investigate corruption when everything else that comes before them has failed to some extent. When institutions have collapsed, they've been kind of strangled by executive power. They're no longer independent, compromised. This is what happened in Malta. This is why my mother was investigating cross-border corruption. If the institutions of the Maltese state were doing their job, then she would have never had to investigate this, and she would have never have had to put her life at risk, and she would therefore have never been murdered. Mm-hmm. It's a sign of institutional collapse. So I think the question is why the journalists have to even investigate these stories in the first place. Mm-hmm. If our states and our international organizations had the tools and they were properly functioning and they were investigating corruption effectively and holding people to account, then we wouldn't even need to do this job. We only need to do it in the most extreme case. It's only when really everything else has collapsed. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's take the theme of this annual meeting, Globalization 4.0. I don't even think that there was a functioning system in the first place. What Globalization 3.0 did is create a global playground for crime and corruption. And we just simply never had the tools to fight it, which is why we are falling back to the investigators of last resort, mm-hmm. who are journalists, and why they are the ones who are being murdered. It's not European officials, or they don't have their lives at risk. They're very happy and safe in Brussels. Mm-hmm. It's all fallen on the shoulders of investigative journalists because we don't have the tools mm-hmm. as a global society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Again, a lot of themes are being drawn out that we'll try to pull together after this first round. But President Vucic, let me ask you, many world leaders are not as adulatory with the press as those of us in the press are, and have fought back with very strong rhetoric and at times with tough new laws against fake or unfavorable news. Are governments justified in these criticism and in passing some new laws that are limiting the ability of the press to investigate?
First of all, thank you very much for giving me a chance to speak here, although I didn't deserve it for many reasons. First of all, wanted to say that Serbia, although we improved our economy significantly, and I'm very proud of our economic reforms in the recent years, for the first time in our contemporary history, we have a surplus in our budget for the third year in a row. Growth rate 4.5, 1 out of 5 European countries with the biggest growth. In 2018, we changed the trajectory of our public debt. When I became the Prime Minister, it was 79% GDP ratio. Now it's below 50%. Everything regarding economy we did in a good way. What we didn't do in a proper way, I wouldn't say it was a freedom of expression. Dare to say that we have still very much polarized press. We have many problems, but I'll speak for myself and I'll take one example just for everybody to learn something from my case. Matthew was speaking at one, I don't know what kind of conference that was, either in Poland or somewhere else, I think in Poland. And he was saying he was doing his preparation and he got some information from Serbian journalists that situation in Serbia was critically bad and something bad might happen in the future. And then he attacked Serbia saying, well, we think that Serbia will be the very next country in which some journalists might be killed. Fortunately, it didn't happen. It happened in 4 or 5 EU countries in the meantime. Some shootings were happening even in Montenegro, but what happened? I'm not here to defend myself or to attack Matthew. I came here and I did it privately before we entered the session, because something happened even in Serbia. One guy was writing something in local press, in papers that I have never heard of, against local guys in power, and surprisingly, or it shouldn't be said surprisingly, his garage was attacked, then fire was spread to the first floor of his house. His entire family were in jeopardy. And then I started thinking of Matthew's words. Although I didn't believe that it might happen in my country, because I thought everything was only false allegations. And I still think that a part of it, anyway, was something like that. We arrested a guy that ordered that. We arrested a guy and a lady that committed that. But still, mastermind hasn't been arrested. And we think that we know who was behind it. And I can say that we expect to finalize the case with all the evidences and proofs within, I can't say, a week or 10 days. But after that, I learned something, and I started to be very cautious and very much afraid. And that's why we need to finish this case, and we need to be so-called brutal in all similar cases. And I'm speaking about our responsibility. I'm not criticizing guys from the opposition that are saying for our journalists that are sluts or whores if they don't like what they do. No, I'm speaking about ourselves. And on the other hand, we haven't criminalized fake news or people that are violating, in a way, professional ways of delivering the truth. And I don't know how to do it, to tell you the truth. We saw a German example, but if we were going to do the same in Serbia, people would say, okay, now you're doing some limitations, you're banning something for us, particularly in social networks, and these are things that are stopping us in that. Anyway, we got not the very best marks in last 2 years from Reporters on Frontier, from Reporters Without Borders.
And Freedom House also.
Yes, and in a way that I'm very proud of our economic reforms and the way that we kept stability, tranquility, and peace in the region. I'm not proud at all because of that, and I'm certain that we're gonna change the trajectory.
So you're committing to improving press freedom?
I had yesterday discussion with people from Reporters Without Borders. I asked them to come to Serbia to give us a necessary support, to bring some experts, particularly regarding state aid for medias, because it seems to be a vital issue. And I'm sure that in a year or two I can come here and that we'll be able to be proud of freedom of press and freedom of expression in a way that I'm very proud of all economic reforms that we have recently taken.
Okay.
I'm sorry that I took a lot of
All right,
time.
no, thank you. Let me turn to Tina, and then we'll come around and talk about some other things. I mentioned social media before, and I just wanted to bring this into the conversation. You have 2 million followers on Instagram and nearly the same number on Twitter. And because of that, I wanted to ask you a question that I hear a lot. A lot of people are saying that one of the reasons the press doesn't get as much protection around the world as it used to get is that governments can go directly to the public through social media, so they don't need us as much. So it used to be if you wore a vest that said press, you were protected because people needed to tell their story, and they told their story to the press. Now, so many people are telling their story directly to social media. Does that create a threat to the press and to the ability of the press to operate safely around the world?
Thank you for your question. First of all, let me say, think that journalism now, in my opinion, is some form of crisis. Because I think all journalists who are here on this panel, we are old-fashioned journalists. We require to be accurate, to be objective, to check the facts, to double-check the facts, to double-check the sources. Now we are living in a new world of infotainment, where the most important world become clickbait. We all are clicking on those news and those articles. And this clickbait brings us into new reality, where I completely agreed with you. There are three important things. First, clickbait shows us that regular viewers, regular readers, everybody who are around us here with the cell phones, they start to compete with us because they can report their own news. Other people can share their news. I think that you remember this priceless example with Donald Trump and Pope. When somebody shared news, somebody printed news that Pope publicly supported Donald Trump. This news went viral. A lot of people shared this link, but nobody was checked. Is this true or is this false? News stays in people's mind, in my opinion, 1 or 2 days. That's not enough. People are clicking on every news, but they are not going to check or verify sources, articles, who are behind these sources. Mm-hmm. That's why, if we talk about old-fashioned journalism, it takes time. It takes time to prepare material, to analyze facts, to talk with editor. Then editor decided finally to publish or not this article. That's why what we can call this process, slow and expensive. What the clickbait is finally, it's a cheap and money-making. Yeah. Clickbait become money spinner. That's why we never know, nobody knows who are behind this. I can say the readers now doesn't need us. Of course, there are a minority of the people who are trying to check facts, to check sources. But actually, if we're talking about majority every day getting a lot of news from fake accounts. That's why, as I know, Facebook and Google are going to invest 300 million each technological company to the local news, for example. Why? Because a local journalist, for example, they face it with big problems in their local areas, but they don't have sources to fight with this. What will be the freedom of the journalist? Maybe journalists will be freelancers for these platforms. I don't think so. I think that now we are, as I said, we are living in the world where no rules. And I think that we have to face to this problem. How to decide this problem? Technological companies invest in the platforms for the new journalists. Governments, of course, they have to pay attention on this new media world. But I think that we don't have possibilities to control clickbait because in old-fashioned journalism, when you have time to prepare your material, it's a slow process that gives opportunity to editor, check everything, and to control, actually, let's say, everything. Clickbait is uncontrollable process. And I think that there is a main threat that we faced right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So a lot of threats have come out. One I'd like to come back to is really the question of whether you can have a successful economy and a successful business and not have a free press. And often people use China as an example of a place that's been very successful financially, has built a dramatically growing economy. It's just, the growth is slowing a little bit, but over many, many years, the economy has grown effectively. And with acknowledgement of the government believes that more controls on the press are appropriate to create a more stable society. So, I'd like to put that question. Does the China example suggest that economies can, in fact, prosper and grow without free expression? I don't know, Marty, you want to take a shot at that and then open it up more?
Well, yeah. I think that obviously you gave a prime example of an economy that has grown without freedom of expression, and to some extent things have gotten worse. To some extent things have gotten a bit better in China. I guess it depends on the perspective that you have on that. I think we need to look at other examples too in other developed economies, which have definitely benefited from having free expression and having a free press. It means, as I said before, that the companies, the economy in general, is governed by the rule of law, as opposed to the whim and desires of those in power, governed by the desire of those in power to stay in power, and that there's an actual competition of ideas. There's a competition of companies. I think that leads to greater innovation, greater progress than what you will find in controlled economies. And I think that that's been proven out over a long period of time, so that power doesn't just go to those who have the biggest megaphone, or to those who hold the most power already, but that it's available to other people. And so you see the growth of new companies, and that they know that the decisions will be made by consumers, whether they're business consumers or individuals as consumers, rather than decisions being made by a government. They will decide who wins and who loses, often based on who supports them. And I think that's a more probable route to success, even with some contrary examples right at the moment.
Yeah. So a related question, open up to anybody, but a lot of multinationals will take the position that working in authoritarian countries or countries without a free press ultimately is helpful because the engagement enables the country gradually to kind of become more progressive around those issues. And so often they'll agree to censorship or to restrictions on intellectual property on the theory that if you engage, you'll have more opportunity to change it. Is that something that others of you think makes sense or is justified by the facts?
It sounds a little like wishful thinking to me. Very often part of the problem is that the companies inevitably participate in corruption. Mm-hmm. And that makes things, it doesn't just guarantee the continued existence of censorship regimes, but it also makes it more dangerous for people who are trying to do something about those issues, because it means they're even more alone. They not just do not have the backing of their government, but they don't have the backing of multinationals that are supposed to be liberal or that themselves depend on the existence of liberal democracy for their continued business.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, I think it also pivots around the question of what kind of business we're talking about and what kind of media we're talking about. Because, if your starting point is that the nature of how business operates in the world is really all pretty good, it's fine, we just need them, free media to run alongside them, then that leads you to one set of analysis. If your starting point is that the economic system that we have right now has patently failed to deliver basic services, basic needs for the majority of people on our planet, that the inequality has reached a point of unsustainability, that we have essentially got a consumption economy that the planet cannot anymore sustain, if we look at the science. When you add all of those facts together, then we have to say that actually what we're talking about is we need a different media environment and we need a different business environment. We need a business environment that reduces the inequality gap. We need to address, and I know this is not a very good place to say this, but we need to address the question of CEO compensation and the bonus culture. which is part of what drives the kind of reckless behavior that we saw that contributed to the global financial crisis. We also need to then ask ourselves, media, we can't talk about the media in a homogenized way, right? Because if we're talking about state-owned media like we have in Russia and China and so on, predominantly with a few that are tolerated on the sides, that's one reality. If we're talking about the US, where you have multiple opportunities, it's a slightly different. But one thing I should say about the US, as somebody who's lived in the United States, right, as a student and then worked there, at the end of the day, the media that has the capability to penetrate national consciousness, that frames the debate, that frames national discourse and so on. And let's be blunt about it. In the US, like if I do a survey with Europeans, I ask the question, how many of you, whenever I encounter anti-American sentiment, like say during the Second World War, the Iraq War, I wasn't alive during the Second World War. Second Iraq War is what I meant to say. So let's do the experiment, right? How many of you have watched CNN International? Please raise your hands quickly. How many of you think CNN International, keep your hands up please for a sec. How many of you think that CNN International is a radical left-wing or an ultra-liberal news source? Keep your hands up. Okay, 1, 2. Right. Okay, so, but let me just introduce this reality, because we always assume that the people in the United States have access to a diverse media environment, right? But the reality is, the people in the United States, Europeans, almost no Europeans will say that CNN is anything of left or liberal persuasion, right? But the citizens of the United States do not see CNN International. They see a right-wing or conservative version of CNN International called CNN or CNN Headline News. But when you look at it in the continuum of the ideological continuum within the United States, CNN is considered to be, together with the MSNBC on the far left, and of course we have Trump TV on the Fox TV on the far left, far right. So I just want to. Therefore, I'm just saying the question is an important question, but it pivots on a range of data analytical points, which I don't think we have consensus in. Because I think for a lot of people at Davos, maybe we think that the world is pretty much fine. We just need some incremental improvements. And I would say that where we are right now, when time is running out for us to address climate, where inequality has got completely out of control, we cannot have rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while we sink. We cannot be content with incremental steps in the right direction. We need fundamental, deep thinking. I don't know the answer, but I know that the current reality is not the solution.
So I mean, I guess one response to that would be, if you're a real free press absolutist, your answer would be, you want to facilitate and allow a free press across a wide spectrum, and you wouldn't want to be making too many judgments about, well, this press is okay and this press isn't, based on the ideology. If a First Amendment absolutist would certainly say that in the U.S.
That's fine, provided that diversity is there, right?
Yeah.
When the diversity is not there, then people are not being empowered to participate meaningfully in public life and in a meaningful democracy. So long as, because I'm committed to diversity, I have no problem with Fox being there, right? But when you have that kind of dominance, the Sean Hannity is calling the president 5 times a day. Yeah. I mean, come on, that's not good media practice.
Tina wanted to say something.
First of all, I want to mention that don't forget that now reaction to events sell events better than events itself. That's a dangerous thing, because it's always about opinion. Let me explain you. No matter what we will transfer now in social media, if it would be something provoke, it always gets much more reaction and emotion than the facts. What it gives us now, these emotions and that reaction, is the most valuable currency in the internet. Somebody knows Telegram, for example. Raise your hands who knows what it is, what the Telegram is. You know what the Telegram is. For me, it was an amazing thing, because I know that we are hardly using this Telegram in the Russia, and it was only messaging app, and finally it became a news platform. Now, for example, interesting is that Telegram is becoming more and more popular in developed and so-called free countries, as United States, Germany, Italy, and in other countries. Why? As a WeChat in China, of course. Because it's a plus and minus. I can't make some opinion and judgment about this. It's possibility for the people that we never had been before to have 100 opinions about event. Who gave these 100 opinions? It's diversity, of course. These accounts are fake or real, who knows? When I'm reading Washington Post, I always know who is editor. When I'm reading different blogs, I never know, is it fake or is it true?
Except there was a fake Washington Post that was put out
Yes,
recently.
it was. Thank you, Stephen.
Added a lot of confusion.
Thank you, Stephen, thank you for this example that you mentioned. It was a brilliant example. On one hand, terrible absurdity, but for the second hand, that's a reality now. And I'm completely sure that there have been a couple of people who believe in this, that there is a news.
Yeah, I hope not.
Well, I just want to point out that I do want to open a lot of time for conversation. We haven't gotten nearly through what at least I was hoping to get through. So let me just jump to something and then we'll open it up to the audience. But I mean, one of the things kind of on our plate was to look at what can the press do to restore trust. And I think a related question really is what can be done to reverse some of the difficulties the press has been having, some of the restrictions on press freedom. I'm not sure we can exactly conflate the questions, but I'd love to ask everybody just to say, I mean, what needs to happen to get us to a better place, both in terms of people's trust in the press and in terms of the press's or the media's ability to do its job. Start with Matthew, and then we'll go all around. And please keep them really brief, because I want to allow more than 15 minutes for discussion.
The way I see it is that destroying trust in the press is part of the authoritarian playbook. It's not necessarily something that we have done wrong. I don't think it's our fault. We're doing as much as we can. It's that trust is being deliberately destroyed when no action is taken for our reports on corruption, the results of our investigations. Then, of course, no trust is going to be built in our work. We depend on repercussions as part of our work, for our work, for trust to be built in us as journalists. Whereas now, we spend the majority of our time having to justify our very existence. And of course, this works in favor of a populist or of an authoritarian regime or a hybrid authoritarian regime. This is precisely what they want. That we spend all our time as activists justifying the work that we do. Right. We shouldn't be doing that.
Not exactly a solution, though. You're sort of defining the problem more.
It's not a solution, no. Yeah. I find it very hard to see other solutions beyond the rule of law. Okay. What we need is the rule of law. We need institutions to be effective. When we report a story about corruption, and it's very clear who the actors are, the evidence is all out there in the public domain, and nothing happens, of course trust in our work is going to be destroyed.
Yeah. Okay.
We need prosecutions, we need investigations by the state. Okay. Then trust will be rebuilt.
Let me move it on. President Vucic, you have been at various times quite critical of various aspects of press coverage in your country. What do you think should happen for the press to become more trustworthy and for you to feel more comfortable with the press?
First of all, I wanted to say one sentence about impact that free press might make on economic environment. I think that's, at least in Europe, something of the biggest significance. Not the biggest, but almost the biggest significance, because Serbia attracted 60% of overall Western Balkans FDI. And we did it because of good laws on economy, good bankruptcy law, very flexible labor law, good subsidies and incentives. And I think that we were able to attract even 70 up to 75% of overall Western Balkans FDIs if we if we could boasted ourselves of having better results.
Can I ask you
these
to
areas.
keep the answers really short, otherwise
Yes.
we won't get to the audience.
Okay, sorry. 2 more sentences. I agree with almost everything that Matthew said. There is something else I wanted to add. We'll have to change ourselves. We'll have to secure press environment, and we'll do it. And I'm almost certain that you are going to find no other leaders in the world that would say the same words as I'm doing today. And everybody else will only defend his or her position, and it's always easy. I'm not going to do that. And on the other hand, there is something that is very much objective and that we cannot beat, none of us. I was present at that one important conference that took place in Abu Dhabi. It was done under Chatham House rule, and former French President Sarkozy was saying something. He was provoked by Matsuyoshi Son, that Japanese guy was number 1 at Forbes list in 2000, and he was saying that there is a lack of leaders in the world today. And then Sarkozy was saying something that was very interesting. He said that it cannot be any leaders in a current world, because you have social networks. You have one guy with one profile, with one post. How can he beat thousands of fake and real profiles? And there is no trust. There is no trust at all. And what Tina was saying today, people sell emotions, not facts. Even if you ask my people in my country whether they are satisfied with economic performance, they would say, although you have all the numbers here, which I exposed, they would say, well, we still feel very poor, we are not satisfied, or whatever else they can find about it. It means that facts are not in fashion.
Yeah.
Emotions are something that you are selling, and negative emotions,
Right.
it's always easier to sell it than positive emotions.
So basically your point is that if the press
My
was
point
focusing
is-
more on facts, and it would be more
Yes,
trustworthy.
my point is that it's not going to be an easy job,
Right.
either for Matthew, either for all the others that would base their business on
Okay.
facts.
I'm going to take only one more answer to this question and then open it up. Kumi or
You asked for recommendations. I want to
just,
give you a very
okay.
specific
All right, you're the last, and then I'm going to open it
I
up.
want to make a very specific recommendation that each and every one of us here can take away something from today's session. Whether you're from government, whether you're from business, whether you're from big business or small business, if there's one thing we can commit to do, is to protect and defend the rights of journalists to do their work. I think that's like now reached a crisis point. You've heard the stats. And I would just use this occasion to say to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who Amnesty has been appealing to over the last 2 weeks, to institute an international independent inquiry into the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I want to use this platform here today to appeal to him to respond to this request and to do this, because the tragedy of Jamal Khashoggi was not simply about Saudi Arabia. It was not simply about one journalist. It was about saying that if we let this thing go without accountability, that any government anywhere on this planet, any member state of the United Nations, can decide, I want to pull a similar kind of operation, and they'll get away with it. So from here in Davos, I say to Antonio Guterres, stand with us, defend journalists, and let's have an independent inquiry into the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll open it up. That does, by the way, just go back to our statistic in the beginning. 85% of journalists killed since 1992. Nobody has been held responsible, the whole issue of impunity. So we're opening it up to the audience now, and I believe there are probably people coming around with microphones. So we'll just kind of move around, but there's one in the middle here.
Good afternoon. My name is Hrvoje Krasic. I'm a journalist with N1 Television, which airs in Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia. My question goes to President Vucic. You said you were yesterday visited by Reporters Without Borders, and if I'm correct me if I'm not, they said that the biggest issue in Serbia is verbal aggression made by those in position of political power towards journalists. Now, thinking of that, my network that I work for was for a well, is still quite critical towards government in Serbia. For a very long period of time, whenever my colleague would come to your press conference, you would emphasize that the question is coming from somebody from the American N1 television. Why would you be doing that in a country that was bombed by NATO, and we're constantly repeating towards somebody that is somehow connected with US is not exactly a compliment?
Thank you for saying this, because it's not only the fact that I'm running away from this type of questions, and I saw that it raised huge interest, not only in my country, but in the entire region. And it shows something. First of all, dear Hrvoje, you couldn't find anything bad that I said about network you belong to. And it's good that you heard that they're doing their job criticizing our government 24/7 with no problems at all. That's something that I'm proud of. On the other hand, yes, I was saying that till 6-7 months ago. Then one of your journalists asked me not to do that anymore. And after that, I haven't repeated it. And I said to them, why do you mind that? Was I saying something that was not true, or was it hurting you? They were saying, yes. We didn't feel well when you were saying that we were coming from the US television. And I said, okay, I'm not going to repeat it. And it has never happened again. And I'm the only one, just for you to know, because it's not that everything's black and white. I'm always accepting and receiving all the journalists in my country, all of them. And I'm the only one who does it. Because if you're going to send, let's say, some journalists to the oppositional headquarters, they don't allow them to enter their premises. I do receive all of them and do reply to everyone on every single question.
So
and I think in a polite way, if that was not the case always, and I think it was, I'm always ready to do an excuse and to change myself.
We got another question in the back here. And let's try to keep the questions to the answers short so we can get in as many as we can.
I have no question, just have two remarks. Matthias Döpfner, CEO of Axel Springer. You asked and discussed why it is in the interest of businesses to operate in an environment where free media can work independently. I think it's very easy. It's maybe in the short term, it may be in the interest of quick deals and quick businesses, but in the mid and long term, it comes with a high cost because it's going to ruin the business. And it has done it in so many cases. Look at the example of Siemens, where it created a moral hazard that they operated in too many countries where the rule of law did not apply and where corruption was necessary, and it basically almost destroyed the company. And look to the car industry operating in China, where now the changes are going to either lead to the situation that they have to leave the country or that they have to get Chinese shareholders in order to survive. And the CEO of Daimler has already apologized publicly because they have quoted in one of their advertising pages the Dalai Lama. I think that's a very clear warning sign that societies without free journalism, without freedom, rule of law, and human rights are going to be very destructive for businesses in the long term. And the second remark that I just want to raise, if it's about independent and free media, I think it is also about intact business models. And I'm just under a kind of shock that just yesterday in Brussels, after years of work on a copyright reform that enables publishers, everybody knows that print is going to die rather sooner than later, to establish successful business models in the digital world based on copyright protection, has not been finished and is probably not going to be approved. I think if we're talking about freedom of expression and freedom of media, we also should discuss the legal framework for intact business models in the digital world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's take some more questions. Steve Clements up front, right here.
Thank you, Steve Clemens with The Atlantic. Stephen, you started with a reference to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the right of free expression. And I guess as I listen to all of you, and there's nothing that anyone has said that I would disagree with, but the question is, the United States used to play a particular role, and I think in its partnership with other great Western liberal democracies, making press freedom such a high point. That's clearly not happening today. And as I look across Europe, I also see a decay and erosion in other countries' commitment to that as well. So when we get a lot of journalists, or we get a lot of people who say we need to do this, is there any example that stands out to any of you today of a nation that is standing out and providing the kind of beacon on this that the United States today is not?
Anybody want to volunteer? Anybody?
Nope. Nope, sadly no.
That's pretty depressing.
It's difficult to think of an example, but
Not one example.
no, the thing is,
Well, Canada is speaking out for free press.
like, this phrase, protect journalists, hides the root cause of the problem, which is the rule of law. You cannot speak about protecting journalists with that. I mean, with Jamal Khashoggi, what are we going to say? That we're going to build walls around someone like him so that Saudi Arabia can't ever get to him? Of course not. That's not a way to live. Not for him, nor for anyone else. And we don't want this kind of peaceful coexistence of journalists who say whatever they want and corrupt politicians or business people who do whatever they want. That's not what we want. We don't want this kind of dirty deal. What we want is the rule of law. And I would say that the countries that are the beacon of hope are the countries like Netherlands, Germany, that they simply don't care about offending other members of the European Union. They're always going to uphold the rule of law, no matter what. They've made that kind of commitment. So, I mean, those countries are a beacon to countries like mine, which are in rapid decay.
Go ahead.
Interesting you mentioned Canada. My name's Goldie Hyder. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Business Council of Chief Executives. You're right, Canada is not only standing up for journalists, it's also been most recently announced it's going to support an industry whose financial model is very much in question. And that's been a subject of much debate in Canada. I'm wondering your point of view on the notion of state involvement. I believe the President mentioned also in supporting an industry whose financial model is such that people are finding an alternate source of information. How much can you do that? How can you do that without compromising the role that you play in society?
Marty, you're sitting in a capital of a country. Do you have thoughts about state support?
Well, yeah, I mean, my own personal view is I'm not in favor of state support for media organizations. I think that makes the news organizations captive to the state. If their financial success depends on receiving money from the government, they'll be very attentive to what the government wants them to say. So I believe that it is true that the vast majority of media is having great difficulty finding a stable business model, but it's not true to say that nobody has found a stable business model. Many have, and I think we need to keep working at that. We need to be self-sustaining. We need to be independent. We need to be independent of any. To be a responsible press, I think that we need to be independent of any party, and we need to be independent of the government itself.
Yeah, Tina.
But in this way, we didn't mention today that there are a couple of countries who had very interesting politics, like China, for example. I was amazed when I find out that, for example, Chinese, if you heard successful media strategy, they invest a lot of money in different medias in all world. For example, Wall Street Journal, 1.3 million copies. New York Times, 1.7 million copies. And they become biggest players in the world because what we can call the business models. As I said before, it's not profitable still to do old-fashioned journalism. Excuse me for these things to say, but that's true. And in that case, we should find somebody who can, I mean, government on serious business, technological companies, whatever, who can support this kind of journalism. Because as I said, it takes time. It needs money, investigations. They need money, they need protection, they need support. And without this, it's very difficult to behave in the world where some countries invested in their own political and informational strategies, where a lot of fake news appears. And who promote fake news? Donald Trump, he humiliates and demonizes journalists for his own benefit. And fake news in 2017 finally became a word of fear. Word of fear, according to Collins Dictionary. That's why in this world it's difficult to find answers. I think that we don't have answers still. We don't know how to behave.
Let's try to get a couple more questions in. Or?
A real-time reaction from Twitter to the panel. Writer Anand Giriharadas, who's been very critical of the WEF, points out that there is a value in bringing the issue of Khashoggi to Davos, but he states something very interesting. He says that the World Economic Forum chose 2 Saudi state companies to be among its strategic partners, and that these companies are chosen because they are aligned with the forum values. So I wanted to give everyone on stage a chance to react to that, because he's saying that the WEF should be called out on this.
It's good. Thank you for this commentary, because I'm sitting in the Twitter too. And excuse me, and you, President, you put a tweet right now. Yeah, I was amazed. I see that you didn't, but I see right now.
But since that's not broadly a press freedom question, I think we'll all absorb.
That's the lady's fault.
Absorb the comment, but take another question or two. One in the middle and one over here, and that's probably the last 2 questions we'll have time for.
Hi, Matt Harrington from Edelman, and I just wanted to go back to the conversation about trust earlier. We launched the 19th edition of the Trust Barometer this morning, and the good news was traditional media the trust in traditional media is its highest ever at 65% versus social media at 44%. I think what was most interesting about the data, and I'd love a reaction to, is that we had a 22-point increase in active engagement in traditional media, and 40% of those also a double-digit increase are amplifiers. So I'm curious, with that sort of seeking out of truth, trusted sources, et cetera, is there something that's going on in journalism, particularly in the traditional space, where there's more active engagement of readers and viewers?
I think the answer is yes, and I disagree that there's no model. I think what's happened is that as social media has proliferated and as people are using it, they've experimented with it, but they've discovered a lot of the pitfalls of social media as well. And now they're beginning to gravitate toward media sources that they consider to be more reliable. There is a success model. We've been successful at the Washington Post by adhering to the traditional values of journalism. We do investigations. We have support for that. In fact, people subscribe to us so that we can do that kind of work. And I think that I'm glad you mentioned the rise in trust, because now people have begun, they did their experimentation, they've had problems, they discovered that a lot of the information out there is false, and they've started to turn to news organizations in which they don't have complete trust. And look, we have our flaws, we're not perfect by any means, we all make mistakes, but they recognize that we work hard to try to get the facts and to try to get the truth. And so I think that is a big reason why there has been a rise in trust.
And it's interesting, when we started thinking about this panel 6 months ago, the premise was that trust in media was at an all-time low. And so it's very interesting to see the trust barometer starting to social movement in a different direction. I actually don't think we have time for any more questions, unfortunately. I think it's really important that the forum has provided this space and this opportunity to talk about press freedom. To my knowledge, this is the first time we've had a full conversation about press freedom on one of the big stages. So I think it's a good sign. And I do want to say that the engagement of multinational organizations, multinational companies, the business community, as well as journalistic community is incredibly important for the future of press freedom. So I especially appreciate that you're all here, that you care about this issue, and maybe we'll see more progress next year in the Trust Barometer. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the panel.